Today was supposed to be deadline day for Christine Blasey Ford to decide if she would be testifying before the Senate Judiciary and discuss her allegations against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. But that deadline, and then a later one, set by Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley, went up in smoke. That, as negotiations between the committee and the doctors' attorneys continue. And tonight, we still do not know what the next chapter in this story will be or how it will play out. GOP Senate leaders and Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh's accuser working to strike a deal about when she'll testify on Capitol Hill. President Trump is no longer holding back, questioning Christine Blasey Ford's credibility.
Why didn't somebody call the FBI 36 years ago?
The president on Fox News, then on Twitter. If the attack on Dr. Ford was as bad as she says, charges would have been filed immediately. The president asking for a police report for Blasey Ford's sex assault allegation against Kavanaugh. The Washington Post reports the California professor says Kavanaugh attacked her at a party in the 80s, but she didn't come forward because she was a scared teen.
There's no reason to attack her. The president is defending his nominee to the United States Supreme Court.
Ahead of next week's presidential hearing,
the allegation being leveled against him is false, and we are proud to stand with Brett.
Support is ramping up for Kavanaugh and Blasey Ford. Demonstrations on Capitol Hill, her family speaking out.
Level-headed, generous, intelligent woman, and she does not deserve to be accused of anything other than that.
Before Blasey Ford even testifies, the Senate Majority Leader told a group of conservative voters, don't worry.
In the very near future, Judge Kavanaugh will be on the United States Supreme Court. Or
in the piece, we showed you snippets of President Trump's tweets this morning about Dr. Ford when he said either she or her, quote, loving parents should have gone to the police. Well, it turns out the president, breaking his Twitter silence on Dr. Ford, may have alienated one of the key Republicans that he needs to get on board here for Brett Kavanaugh to appoint to the Supreme Court. Susan Collins, back home in Maine, quoted by the AP as saying she was appalled by the president's criticism of Dr. Ford. No word if she's so appalled that she'd consider withholding her vote for the nominee. But the public certainly does seem to be souring on the Kavanaugh nomination, and the judge, he's earned a new distinction as a nominee. He has become the first Supreme Court nominee in the history of the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll to ever poll underwater. That is, more people opposing his nomination than supporting it. And Kavanaugh, he has hemorrhaged support in just the last month. He's down 8 points among all voters in the past month, down 10 points among women, particularly over 50 years old, and down 5 among suburban women, a key demographic in this midterms, and is now minus 11 among suburban women. He's also down an astounding 31% among independent voters in the past month, and also down nearly 20 among seniors. Everywhere you look, it is not looking good for Kavanaugh, but that's in the public sphere. Now, for more perspective on Dr. Ford's allegation and how she is being thwarted right now, we caught up with two very influential and experienced women, two people both who have experience both in law enforcement and as legislators. First up, current Congresswoman and former Nassau County DA Kathleen Rice. We asked the Congresswoman her reaction to those who claim that Judge Kavanaugh's alleged actions 30 years ago really shouldn't matter when deciding if he ought to sit on the high court now.
I just can't believe that we are having this conversation about something that, people are even asking the question, why are we talking about something that happened 36 years ago? In this moment, in this country's history, where we're talking about, hashtag Me Too, and we're talking about women empowerment, we're talking about all the scandals that came out from the Catholic Church. And the question is, why now? We all know why now, because people don't feel, especially when they are victimized when they are young, that they can come forward and speak. And I was really hopeful that when this came out that we would have approached this very differently. But when you look at the committee that's dealing with this, there are 11 members of the committee on the Republican side, and they are all men. So I'm not surprised that this is the approach that the committee is taking. I think it's pretty disgraceful.
Next up, we asked Congresswoman Rice to respond to this quote from Senate and Judiciary member Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. He's called for Dr. Ford's allegations. He called them a drive-by shooting and said, I'm going to listen to the lady, but we're going to bring this to a close.
What can you even say about that? I think Senator Graham should be ashamed of himself. I'll listen to the lady. We should want a full investigation. This should not come down to, all right, we'll give her her 5 seconds. God knows why she's coming up with this story now. But, you know, it's so interesting to me because when people say, well, how credible can this woman be? How credible can Dr. Ford be when she's talking about something that happened 36 years ago? Well, I don't understand the hypocrisy when Republicans say that because they're so ready to say, well, Brett Kavanaugh has a wonderful memory when it comes to what happened 36 years ago. He says he wasn't there. Why is it that his credibility on something that happened 36 years ago is airtight? And when Dr. Ford talks about what happened, she can't possibly remember what happened 36 years ago. It's such a double standard, but it's so typical. You know, of this he said, she said thing. When you have a he said, she said, most of the time he said wins. And what this committee is doing is, I think, a travesty. There's more of a reason to believe that Dr. Ford has a better memory about what happened 36 years ago than Brett Kavanaugh does. I mean, the exploits of Brett Kavanaugh and his friends at their school were well documented in Mark Judge's book. I think at the very minimum, this committee should want to hear from Mark Judge, who was an eyewitness to this by everyone's account. His story about what he saw, what he didn't see has changed over time, which makes it even more important that the committee do a full investigation, not just hearing from Dr. Ford and Brett Kavanaugh, but from Mark Judge and anyone else who might have relevant information. I mean, I just can't even believe that we're talking about this issue in 2018. And I just think, again, you look at the makeup of the committee. That's Exhibit A for what's wrong with Washington. Some of the members on the Republican side and the Democratic side, for that matter, were there almost 30 years ago when the same issue arose with Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. That's also a problem that we have to deal with. But the fact that those people, those men on the committee for Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas are still the same ones now, and their feelings about this issue have not evolved, that's, I think, one of the more relevant things that we should be talking about, why their opinions on this issue, given everything that we know now in 2018, have not evolved.
And we also spoke about Dr. Ford with Liz Holtzman. Holtzman, a former congresswoman from New York and the first woman ever elected as New York City Controller. She was also, at one point, the Brooklyn Attorney General. She also has a unique perspective on what's happening in Washington right now. You know what? I want to read you a couple comments and get your perspective as to where we are now and how much has or hasn't changed in the last 3 decades or so. The president said, tweeting, of course, that, hey, I have no doubt that if the attack on Dr. Ford were as bad as she says, charges would have been immediately filed with local law enforcement authorities by either her or her loving parents. Lindsey Graham said, talking about Judge Kavanaugh, this has been a drive-by shooting when it comes to Kavanaugh. I'll listen to the lady, but we're going to bring this to a close. When you see all this play out, do you say to yourself, as somebody who was the first on a lot of things, you were a district attorney, congresswoman, did a lot of things on both the national and international stage. Wow, that we're having this conversation means that a lot has changed, or it's the same BS from 30 years ago. So the same things that I've seen really haven't changed much.
Well, the president is the assaulter-in-chief. He's admitted to groping women against their will, so one has to discount everything he says on this subject, and it's an outrage. It's totally untrue. Women don't come forward immediately. Some do. Many don't. Look at what happened in terms of the Catholic Church and the issues of abuse in the Catholic Church. It took many years, decades, for some of those victims to come forward. Is the president going to say that every one of those accusers is a liar? And Lindsey Graham to say this is a drive-by shooting? He knows better. They're the ones who are assaulting the institutions of our democracy, and everybody wants to turn this into a drive-by shooting by going full speed ahead. They're the ones who are demeaning victims of sexual assault, and it's outrageous.
You mentioned this isn't about politics, but we know it is. Every Supreme Court confirmation, there's a political element to this. What do you say to people who say Dianne Feinstein, she should have handled this differently. This came out, she didn't want to make this an issue during the confirmation hearings. I know there was privacy concerns she was respecting, but now after the Judiciary Committee has done the Q&A, now only the 11th hour is this coming to the national public. What about that argument?
Well, listen, let's assume that Dianne Feinstein did the wrong thing. That's one part of this. That's not relevant at this point. What's relevant at this point is we have a nominee who's been accused of what could amount to, I don't know the law in Maryland, it could amount to attempted rape. Not only was he, according to the accuser, acting by himself, but there was somebody else with him. That compounds the seriousness of the alleged crime. This was a very serious potential crime by two men who were assaulting a woman, according to the allegation. You can't push this under the rug. Go through a serious investigation. If it turns out that it's not true, won't the American people have more confidence in the person who's been elevated to the Supreme Court than if we never have an investigation and the charges hang over his head? Kavanaugh himself should be calling for a full investigation here.
But at this point, we know, as much as I agree with you, that ship's probably sailed. McConnell and Grassley, they're not going to involve the FBI. The president sure as heck isn't going to ask for it. So,
right,
assuming,
but you know,
assuming though, Liz, it gets now to the floor. And we know this is really in an audience of maybe 3 or 4 people, Murkowski, Collins, maybe Flake and Corker, that are really the only ones theoretically that could vote differently than they've already said for the most part. If they're on the fence and they hear she comes across as credible. Conversely, you also have Kavanaugh that comes across as credible. And it's a he said, she said to that point. Does tie go to the rudder? How do you decide if you were casting a vote? Let's say it was a Merrick Garland, for example, and you happen to like the positions that he may have taken. Would you give him a lifetime appointment if you weren't sure?
It's not a question of not being sure. This is a process that's faulty. I believe what should happen now is that the district attorney in Montgomery County ought to commence an investigation of what happened. This could be a state crime in Maryland. It may require the alleged victim to come forward and make a complaint, but maybe she should consider doing that, because I can't imagine if they went ahead with an investigation in Montgomery County that anybody would vote for his confirmation at this point, because you have ongoing investigation.
What do you think? What's your sense here? I
think it's not going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. In the end, I don't think it's going to happen, because, you know, it shouldn't happen, and I'm praying, hoping that it doesn't, because this is not, I'm not talking about ultimate guilt or innocence. I'm talking about a process that the American people can have confidence in terms of having a thorough investigation of what happened. You cannot ask an accused, did you do it? The accused says no. End of story. That can never be the case. What do we have a criminal justice system for if all we do is ask an accused, did you do it? No, I didn't. No, I didn't commit the robbery. No, I didn't commit the burglary. End of story. This is ridiculous. We know it's ridiculous.
We're going to see soon enough, Liz. I appreciate your time so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And up next, much more on Ford and Kavanaugh. That as we shift away from the law and the politics and onto the other debate that America is having about it. What we are really saying at the water coolers and at the coffee breaks across the country. Stay with us.